Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to The Defense Rests, the podcast where we analyze criminal trials from an actual practicing and litigating criminal defense attorney. I'm your host, Rachel-Diane. Today is part 2 of one of the most infamous and still highly debated criminal trials to have ever hit the United States. Under the legal lens today, the People versus Casey Anthony, the most hated woman in America. So then the district attorney calls a woman by the name of Amy Huzenga to the stand, and she had become fast friends with Casey, and she even testified that she actually thought that she was going to move in with Casey, that they had been looking for apartments together, but every time it kind of came to pulling the trigger, Casey had like some excuse on like why she couldn't do it. And then she told Amy that actually her parents were going to give her the house, that her parents were going to be moving out, and that she was allowed to have the house as long as she took over the mortgage payment. So if Amy wanted to, she could live with her at the home. Amy testified that Casey actually had a growing annoyance with her mom, Cindy, because she was saying during May and like the beginning of June, Casey would be asking her mom to watch Kaylee, and that Cindy was saying, no, like I can't watch her tonight, like you're gonna have to figure it out. And therefore, because of that, Casey would get really upset because she had to stay home and she couldn't go out with her friends, and she had to stay home and watch Kaylee. And the people tried to prove this testimony by Amy by introducing a text message that Casey had sent Amy, and it was dated on May 3rd at 11:30 p.m. And Casey sent Amy this text message, and I quote, "Downtown tomorrow. My mom owes me. This week I'm there. No way I'm staying home." Amy also testified that Casey was actually having problems with her car in the month of June. That Amy received a text message on June 27th at around 11:34 a.m. that said, "There's definitely part of a dead animal plastered to the end of my car." Amy continued to testify that Casey told her that she had noticed a bad scent was coming from the car and that it had continuously got worse, and that Casey said that she believed that George, who would actually frequently borrow her car, apparently had used the car at some point in time and maybe ran over a dead animal. Amy also said that Casey's car was consistently running out of gas, and that there was numerous times that her or Tony Lazaro would have to actually go pick Casey up and take her to her parents' house to get the gas cans to fill up gas and then take those gas cans to the car so she can get gas in the car, right? And she said that Casey ended up telling her that the car had ran out of gas again, and that she was going to have to leave her car at this place called Amscott, and that she didn't want to leave her car there, but like basically she was told she had to leave her car there, and that she really hoped that the car didn't get towed. There was some testimony that was elicited by the district attorney at this point in time that I actually think hurt their case more than helped their case. They testified that Casey was invited to a party on July 4th, and that Casey had actually turned down the party. And she said that the reason why Casey turned down the party was she said that she wasn't able to get any childcare for Kaylee, and so she was going to sit out July 4th to stay with her daughter and watch her daughter. There was another instance from July 8th to July 15th where the entire group, including her boyfriend, was going to go to Puerto Rico for the week, and that Casey had actually been invited. But that last minute, after the group had left, Casey said, "Oh no, I can't go with you guys. I'm sorry, I couldn't secure childcare for Kaylee. I need to stay behind and watch her." Now, I guess this can be interpreted either way. I think the DA can use it to argue that this is showing the elaborate ruse because none of her friends have seen Kaylee at all since June 16th. Now that it's July, she's gonna like pretend that she's with her daughter so they can think that her daughter's somewhere. But in my opinion, I think it hurts their motive, at least. Their theory, their motive is that she killed Kaylee in order to live this child-free life and this party lifestyle, and she was always out and about. But these are two really major events that a party lifestyle person would really want: July 4th and a trip to Puerto Rico with her boyfriend and all of her best friends. And she's saying no, that she doesn't have childcare. I don't know why she would say the childcare part, but it hurts the theory of the party girl image to miss out on two huge events. So Lee Anthony was called to the stand next by the prosecution, and he is the brother of Casey Anthony, the son of George and the son of Cindy, the uncle of Kaylee. His direct testimony was relatively completely redundant of what Cindy Anthony was saying between all of the lies, the imaginary friends, not seeing Kaylee, not hearing from Kaylee, and then also the night that the police were called. But what was important in Lee's testimony is the cross-examination, because again, cross-examination from either party is just as important as your case in chief, because a lot of times you can get really good nuggets out of there that support your case and hurt opposing counsels, and I think the defense was able to do that here as well. On cross-examination, Lee testified that George Anthony actually had a second set of keys to the car that Casey drove, and that the car was actually technically George's, but that they had given it to Casey and that she was the main driver of the car, but George kept the second set of keys, and that he would actually use the car from time to time. Specifically, he would take the car every single week because he wanted to go detail the car and get it cleaned, and that he had never missed a week of keeping this car maintained. Lee also testified on cross-examination that the night that Cindy called the police to report Kaylee missing, George did in fact call him and tell him that he had to get home because something was going to be going down at the house, right? And so he didn't know why. He didn't ask more questions. He just head home. He also said that George did get home before the police arrived to question about the missing child, and that George never went into Casey's room and he never talked to Casey either. So he never asked Casey what's going on. He never asked Lee what was going on. He didn't ask Cindy what was going on. He kind of avoided Casey in general. So next, a bunch of police officers were called to the stand by the district attorney. I'm going to group all of their testimony together so the story can just kind of flow a little bit. So there was Sergeant Eric Edwards, Kevin Barry, John Allen, Officer Fletcher, Officer Acevedo, and then Detective Yuri Melich, and many other people were called to the stand. The police received a phone call from Cindy Anthony asking them to come arrest her daughter, Casey Anthony, because she had stolen the parents' car and that they had just gotten it out of impound, and that's how they knew that their car was stolen. They then said they received another phone call from Cindy Anthony and that this phone call was very worried. The first phone call wasn't worried. It was very just blatant matter of fact, I need you to come arrest my 22-year-old daughter. She stole the car. They said a little bit later is when a very frantic phone call came in saying that she had just picked up her daughter's car from the impound. It smelled like a dead body. Something is wrong. Her daughter just told her that her granddaughter, Kaylee, has been missing for 31 days and that, in fact, she was kidnapped. They said when they arrived to the house that Cindy Anthony was clearly very, very distraught. She was a wreck. And that George Anthony was very quiet and that he didn't really talk much and he just kind of kept to himself and had a very calm demeanor. And they said Casey was like very monotoned, right? That she wasn't really showing any displays of worry, but that she was annoying because she wouldn't answer any of their questions. So the detectives that came to take the missing persons report was Fletcher and Acevedo, and they testified both about the odor. Fletcher said that he actually didn't smell an odor, but Acevedo said he did, but that he chalked it up, and what he thought it was the odor of garbage. But he also said that he doesn't have much experience, like even though he's a detective, he doesn't have much experience in the smell of decomposition, so he actually wasn't very comfortable answering questions on what the odor could have been, whether it has trash or whether it was a dead body. And it was testified to that Casey finally started answering some questions and that she had told them that the last time she saw her daughter was on June 16th when she dropped her daughter off at her nanny's house named Zanny Fernandez Gonzalez, and that Zanny lived at Sawgrass Apartments complex, and that she had dropped her off there before she went to work at Universal Studios, and that when she came back from Universal Studios, nobody was there and nobody was answering her phone calls. In fact, when she tried to call the nanny the cell phone was turned off. It was disconnected. She then said that she went to parks and malls and other places that she knew that Zanny liked to take Kaylee to, and that she could not find her daughter at all. And that the reason why she didn't report her daughter missing was because that she was scared if she did, something would happen to her daughter. She said that Zanny was a half black, half Puerto Rican woman that had been babysitting Kaylee for quite some time now, ever since she was basically an infant. Right, so the officers then testified that they got Casey into the police car. She wasn't arrested, she wasn't handcuffed, and she took them to Sawgrass Apartments. Now, it was after midnight, so nobody was there. She pointed to a unit, specifically Unit 210, and said that that's where Zanny lived at. The officers went up, knocked on the door, no one answered. They looked in, and they noticed that the unit was completely vacant. They didn't really think too much at the time because, according to Casey's story, her daughter has been missing for 31 days. That she had been kidnapped 31 days ago. So that's enough time to flee and take your shit with you. They then said that they went to Sawgrass Apartments the next day, and they talked to one of the supervisors at the complex, and they said that a woman by the name of Zanny Fernandez Gonzalez has actually never lived at the apartment complex, and that the apartment unit 210 in specific has been vacant for about 5 months now. However, the property manager by the name of Amanda Macklin, she did tell the officers that there was a woman by the name of Zanny Fernandez Gonzalez that actually checked in or like had a guest card on June 17th, which is one day after Kaylee went missing, according to Casey Anthony, right? And they said that she had checked in, she had a guest card, and she was there to tour the apartments and look at them, and then she left. The officers then contacted Universal Studios because, again, they testified that Casey told them, she dropped her daughter off because she had to go to work. So they're curious if she told them or had something called an outcry witness, as Casey did say that she had an outcry witness that worked at Universal Studios. Now, an outcry witness is when somebody's in distraught and I come to you and I just blab my mouth, right? The officers contacted Universal Studios and they were able to talk to the assistant manager at loss prevention of Universal Studios. His name was Leonard Tortua, and he told the officers, he was able to look up on his computer and stuff, that no one by the name of Casey Anthony worked at Universal Studios. And in fact, there was no record of Casey Anthony ever working at Universal Studios. He said that only information they had of a Casey Anthony was back in May of 2006, that she was actually working for a third party that kind of had like an event or a pop-up per se at Universal. And that was the only time she had ever worked there, that she was never an actual employee of Universal Studios. From here, the police officers actually asked, they called Casey Anthony and they asked her, hey, can you come with us to Universal? We want to talk to your outcry witness and people that work at Universal. She actually said yes. She got in the car with them. She went to Universal Studios. This is when they met Leonard Tortua. And she's like, hi, I'm an employee here. My name is Casey Anthony. And he looks at her and he says, no, you're not. I do not have anybody by the name of Casey Anthony that works here. And she says, my supervisor's name, my manager's name is XY. I can't remember the name. And he looked up that name and he goes, no, nobody by that name works here either. But a supervisor ended up coming down and was like, look, just let her in. I don't know if she's some third party. I don't know if she's working for a third party event management group. I don't know, but just let her in. So they let her in. She takes the officers to the event tower, where the event planners are. Leonard Tortua looks at them and the officers testify that he said, there is no such thing as event offices, but let's just go. They get down a hallway and Casey finally gets to a dead end, looks at them and puts her hands in her back pocket and says, I actually don't work here. So after that, the officers testified that they started questioning her and saying, everything you've told us is a lie. We know it's a lie. She says, no, not everything I've told you is a lie, just some things. They then pressure her and the recording of this interview is played, right? And the officers are saying, no, you've lied about everything. You said that Zanny has been your nanny for 2 or 3 years now and that she has lived at Sawgrass Apartments that entire time. We went there. There's nobody by that name that has ever lived in that apartment complex. Like, she does not exist. You then said that you work at Universal Studios. That's a lie. You then said you had like this outcry witness here. That's a lie. Like, nothing you're saying is true. You're lying about everything. They try to get her to come clean and be like, look, just tell us what happened. We have had like so many interviews with women whose children have drowned in the pool, whose children have actually fell off the bed and died. Just tell us what the hell happened here, because it's just gonna like get worse for you if you keep lying. She says no. She sticks to her story, says no. I dropped my daughter off at Sawgrass Apartments with Zanny, and Zanny took her, as she always does, to watch my daughter, and my daughter never came back. Like, she is kidnapped. She stuck to that story. So that's when the police officers testify that they arrested her. And they arrested her for child neglect, and they arrested her for lying to police officers, basically having this like false investigation based off of lies. So with Casey lying paired with the 911 phone call from Cindy Anthony saying that it smells like there's been a dead body in Casey Anthony's car, the police officers were able to get a warrant to search the vehicle at George's home. So when they got there, they noticed that the car had a very terrible scent coming from the trunk. So they called in 2 cadaver dogs. So it's important to know that the protocol with cadaver dogs is to always have 2 of them to try to get the most accurate reading, I guess. This is like protocol in Florida. And they said that the first cadaver dog alerted to the back of the truck like immediately, that the dog had jumped up on its 2 paws and he had put it on the back of the trunk, and then he sat down pointing to the trunk, right? But then he said on the second sweep around that the next cadaver dog actually didn't alert to the trunk, that he alerted to the back seat of the car where Kaylee's car seat would have been sitting. They also said that they took the cadaver dogs to the backyard of the Anthony home because they had noticed that something that resembled a shallow grave was actually like dug out in the backyard, and they thought that this was really abnormal. So they had the dogs go out into the backyard and sniff, but neither cadaver dog alerted to the shallow grave. Instead, they actually alerted to an odor that was on the grass that was in between Kaylee's playhouse and her sandbox. The officers testified that when they opened the trunk of the car where that one cadaver dog had alerted to, they had noticed that the trunk had been like cleaned out. They noticed that somebody took a vacuum to it, and it was very obvious that someone had tried to clean the trunk. They said that there was this unusual stain in the trunk of the car, and they said that it was the size of a child's body. Then there was a detective by the name of Mike Vincent, and he testified that he was with the Orange County Sheriff's Department for the CSI, for the crime scene investigators, and that he was actually the assistant. And on July 21st of 2008, he went back out to the car, and he went with somebody by the name of Dr. Michael Sigmund, and they took samples of air from the trunk. He said that they would like suck out air with syringes, and then they would like deposit the syringes into a bag. And that's how they took these air samples. They said that they hung carbon filters in a closed trunk of the Casey Anthony car. And they did this to absorb any chemicals that may be floating around in the air in there. They also took samples of the tire cover and put it in a can. And they took samples of other fabric within the car, including the carpet where the stain was, and also like put it into a can. He testified that he had to go back multiple times to use like different gadgets to like collect the air from the trunk of the car, and that he has no training on collecting air samples, that it's not protocol, it's not something that he's ever learned in the academy, but that he was just following the instructions that was sent to him by a man by the name of Dr. Voss. So all of these samples were then taken and sent over to the laboratory for Dr. Voss to analyze. Next, the district attorney, after all of these millions of officers, they call a man by the name of Roy Crunk to the stand, and he was a meter reader for Orange County in Florida, and he had pulled off to the side of the road and he needed to use the bathroom. So he went like 20 to 40 feet away from the road into like this wood area, and that's where he found skeletal remains, and he was the one that called the police to report the skeletal remains. Now, the remains and where he found these bones, it was a block and a half away from the Anthony home. Then a woman by the name of Dr. G, or Dr. Jan Garvalia, she was also called to the stand. Dr. G is the chief medical examiner, and it's her job to not only identify the body, who the body belongs to, but it's also her job to determine death, the cause of death. She said the scene where the remains were found, it was 20 to 40 feet off the road in a highly vegetative state, and something that she would describe as a junkyard, a place where it's common for a trash landfill, if so to say. Like, people drop off garbage here a lot. It's very frequent, it's very dirty, but it's also very vegetative, a lot of animals because of the garbage, right? And she said that there was bones in a bag, and it was kind of mixed in with the vegetation, and that the bones were scattered about, and she thinks it's because there were animals that got to the bones and had like kind of dragged them out of the bag. She states that the bones were dry boned, meaning that there was no tissue, like no soft tissue, no muscle, no blood, nothing. It was literally like dry to the bone. Therefore, she had to take a piece of the bone and she had to send it out for DNA testing, and that's when it came back positive as Kaylee Anthony's remains. So the manner of death, she ruled a homicide. And this was really ridiculed by the defense because they told her to explain, well, how did you determine this was a homicide? Was there any blunt force trauma to the bones? And she said, no, we had looked at all of the bones under a microscope and there was absolutely no sign of blunt force trauma. There's no signs of any breaks. There's no signs of stab wounds. There's no signs of fractures. There's no signs at all showing that there was any trauma to the body. She said that the reason why she ruled this a homicide, and the reason why the only answer to this is a homicide, is because of the way that the remains were found. The remains were in a trash bag, 40 feet off of a main road, in a site that's very much known as like a dumping site, and they were like trying to be hidden. And because these remains were in the bag and they were trying to be hidden, it was very obvious that it was tucked away, and therefore no one wanted them to be found, so it's a homicide. She also said that another reason why she believes it was a homicide was because there was a piece of duct tape that was attached to the remains. So there was like where the hair area was, I guess there was still like a little bit of hair left, and the duct tape was slightly stuck to the hair as well as to like the mandible, right? So when you decompose, your mandible, your jaw, gets detached from your skull. Because there's no tendons, there's nothing, no muscles keeping it there. And that the mandible was still slightly in place and connected to the skull because of this duct tape. So she said that the duct tape shows that this was murder because the duct tape was the murder weapon, and that the duct tape would have been used to suffocate Kaylee. So next, the district attorney called Dr. Voss to the stand. Dr. Voss was there to testify about the air samples that he had tested that were taken from the trunk of Casey's car. But before then, he has to lay out why he should be an expert witness. And he talked about how he knew about the 4 stages of body decomposing, which is the fresh stage, the purification stage, the bloating stage, and then the active decay stage. He testified that the rate of decomposition can definitely alter and change with the weather. For example, hot, humid weather like Florida can speed up a body decomposing. But he also said that an area that is a non-aerobic environment, such as a dead body inside of a plastic bag, a trash bag, will actually slow down decomposition. He testified that he studied for 5 years at a place called the Body Farm, where he would be studying odors and chemical compounds that were produced from decomposing bodies. He said that at the Body Farm, he specifically got training on 10 different bodies and instances of above ground remains. So remains that were found in bags, remains that were loosely covered up, remains that were just laying on the surface, remains that were covered in tarp, things of that nature. And I'm going to read this directly off of my notes because there's no way that I can have this memorized. I don't do science. He said with these remains, what they would do is that he would collect that he collected air with triple absorbent traps with activated carbon. As air passes through the traps, it captures the chemicals in the air. To facilitate this, he would place tubes near, under, above, or around the bodies, using air pumps to suck the air and shoot it through the carbon traps. He then described how he would take the traps to the lab, heat them up, releasing the chemical, which captured and studied his instruments like the gas spectrometer. Okay, so now he's declared as an expert witness. The defense is objecting. They say it's junk science. He shouldn't be an expert. It's overruled. He can testify. So now he begins testifying about the samples of air that he took from Casey Anthony's car through the police. He said with the air samples, he was able to study the chemistry composition within the air. He said that when a person dies, their body slowly starts to decompose and it builds up these gases that are then released into the area where the body is laying. He said that he specifically himself developed a testing technique that can identify the presence of decomposition gases in a sample of air, and that this testing required you to put the sample into a paint can, seal the paint can, spin it, and have the vapors come out onto the sample of the side of the paint can, where then you can kind of like swatch them, put them into a machine that can then separate all of the chemicals into the original forms in which they used to be. He said that after reviewing the data testing, that he believes that there is no other possible explanation besides that there was a decomposing body in the trunk of the car. They also used Dr. Voss to explain how Kaylee died, or to the best of their ability, how Kaylee died. He said that during his analysis of the decomposition of the gases, he noticed an extremely high level of chloroform. He's testified that chloroform is a natural gas or body secretion that will come out during decomposition, but that the level of chloroform within the air sample was so unbelievably high that it was not natural. He testified also that through all of his years of analyzing human decomposition, he has never seen that high of a level of chloroform. He also testified that when he analyzed the carpet sample from the stain from the back of the trunk, that there was also chemicals that were found in there that would be in the later stages of decomposition, such as calcium, magnesium, and sodium. He determined that the odor would have been coming from the carpet and not from the trash that was left in the car. And Jose Baez really went to town on discrediting him, not only on cross-examination, but you'll hear on the defense's case, he just went to town on the district attorney's expert witnesses. So on cross-examination, Jose Baez comes out and has Dr. Voss testify to the fact that he invented this science. There's no other scientist that's using it. It's not a widely used science at this point in time, that it has never been introduced at trial. He's never testified about it at trial either. It hasn't been allowed in. This is the first time a judge has ever ruled that he can come in and testify about these air samples. He also had Dr. Voss admit on cross-examination that he's actually not a chemist, that he has no education or formal training. He doesn't have a PhD, he doesn't have an undergrad, he doesn't have a master's in chemistry. That in fact, his PhD is actually in anthropology and not chemistry. He said that the last time he's taken a chemistry class was in the 1980s. Also on cross-examination, Dr. Voss testified about how his job, specifically in the forensic lab, was only to determine what chemicals are there, and it's not actually to determine or have any knowledge on the amount of quantity of chemicals that are found. But that part of his job is to be able to say it's high peak or low peak, but that's it. And the reason why this was significant was because the prosecution was trying to have him testify, and part of their big hitting evidence through this expert witness was the quantity of chloroform that was found, but he's saying that's actually not his job. He also testified that there was no, I hate science. He testified that there was no fluorinate compounds that were found in the carpet of the car, of the trunk, and that is actually very typically and most likely should be found in human decomposition samples. A Dr. Michael Rickenbach was also called to the stand. He was a forensic chemical examiner with the FBI, and he actually does have a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in chemistry, and he testified that the samples that were taken, like the fabric samples, that was the fabric sample that was covering the spare tire, as well as a fabric sample that was along the left to right portion of the inner trunk, that they both showed signs of chloroform. But during cross-examination, this doctor actually testified, this doctor for the FBI actually testified that the chloroform samples that were found within the fabric was actually very, very, very small, and that it was inconsistent with decomposition, and that it was actually more consistent with common household cleaning products, such as cleaning products that you would use to clean your car. This testimony was obviously really big for the defense. It also showed that his testing versus Dr. Voss's testimony of the levels of chloroform are not consistent with each other. So what the prosecution is trying to do with the chloroform is basically say that, like, hey, chloroform is a substance that is used to typically like render people unconscious. And so Casey had doused her daughter with chloroform, had maybe used the fabric in the car to douse her daughter with chloroform, knock her out in a humane way, and then suffocate her with duct tape. Then the district attorney called somebody by the name of Karen Lowe to the stand. She had been in the FBI for 13 years. She was a trace evidence examiner. And there was a strand of hair that was found in the car. And this specific strand of hair is the one that she examined. And she said that she couldn't get an exact DNA match for the hair because the root of the hair wasn't actually attached. And that is what is actually used to get an exact DNA match. So all what they can use is the mitochondrial DNA, which is the maternal DNA, to kind of figure out who it was. And through this mitochondrial DNA, they were able to determine that it was one of the Anthony women, either Cindy, Casey, or Kaylee. And they ruled that it was Kaylee due to multiple factors. It was untreated virgin hair, so there was no bleaching, there was no dye on it. It also was only 9 inches in length, which was more consistent with the length of Kaylee's hair than Casey's hair. She said that the fact that it didn't have a root to it means that this hair wasn't naturally shed from the head, that it was more consistent with being pulled out of the head. She then testified that there was this dark band, this very noticeable dark band and dark ring that was beginning to form around the hair. And she said that this ring is called a decomposition ring, and that this begins when the body is dead, the person is dead, and they start to decompose. On cross-examination, she brought out that no, we can't exactly tell who this hair belongs to. Again, there wasn't the root of the hair, so yes, there's a possibility that it may not be Kaylee's, but we think it is. Then she also testified that this decomposition band, this dark ring, it doesn't actually only mean somebody's dead. That this decomposition band can actually happen for multiple factors, and it could also just happen because the hair itself is dead and like decomposing, right? Because hair, she said, is actually like, I don't know, follicles or it's kind of like your skin. I don't know. It's weird. I'm not a doctor. But she said that no, it could happen from like humidity, it could happen from the hair just dying, it could happen from a bunch of other things, but that hair banding is pretty much consistent in deceased people, that you don't very see it often in alive people. But no, that she could not say for certain that this came from a dead body, because it is true that hair banding can happen in other ways besides decomposition. And so with that, the prosecution rests. So to wrap up their theory in a nice, pretty little bow quickly, the district attorney's theory is that Casey wanted to have a child-free life, that she wanted to live the life of a 22-year-old because that's how old she was, and that she wasn't able to do that with a 2.5-year-old toddler, and that she was missing out on partying, and she was missing out on hanging out with her friends whenever she wanted to, and she wasn't able to like go move out of her parents' home and live by herself because taking care of a toddler is like really expensive and all of these things. So she decided to kill her daughter. And how she did it was that she knocked out Kaylee and made her unconscious through chloroform, that she had doused fabric in chloroform. She had rendered her unconscious, and then she put duct tape over Kaylee's nose and mouth to smother her in order to suffocate her. And after Kaylee was dead from dying in her sleep through suffocation, she wrapped her in her favorite Winnie the Pooh blanket, stuffed her into trash bags, and then put the dead body in the trunk of the car, where she then went to her boyfriend's house, watched blockbuster movies, and then the next day took the dead body to the wood area that was 1.5 blocks away from her home and got rid of the body there. Now it is time for the defense to put on their case. And the defense actually called an obscene amount of witnesses on the first day, and they were all like with the FBI, which was actually really smart to use the FBI against the district attorney, because we all know that the police department and the district attorney are hand in hand, and they actually are a unit that work together. So to use the district attorney's people like against them was actually really smart. They even recalled multiple of the DA's witnesses to the stand, but now as defense witnesses. So they called Gerardo Blois to the stand. He was a CSI investigator for the FBI, and he said that through all of the testing of the trunk, the fabric, clothing, the Winnie the Pooh blanket, all this stuff, that there was no blood and no DNA found on any of it. Then Heather Serbert was also called back to the stand as well. And again, she's a DNA examiner for the FBI. And she said, again, that all of the testing that they did on the fabric that was in the trunk of the car, all of it came up negative for blood. And there was actually no DNA profiles that could be generated from any of the evidence samples that they took. He then went and had Heather focus on the duct tape, what the prosecution says is the murder weapon. So in regards to the duct tape, Heather actually said that they weren't actually able to remove any DNA from the duct tape, that the only DNA that they were able to remove from the duct tape, they were not allowed to use because it fell below the FBI standards. But that she was able to retrieve some information from the DNA that was taken from the duct tape. And I mean the sticky side of the duct tape, because she said no DNA was found on the shiny part of the duct tape. That only on the sticky side, they were able to remove some DNA, but that it fell below standard. She testifies, and I'm going to read this verbatim, because again, I am not a scientist. She testifies that DNA typing and analysis is of something called 13 markers or locations, where a DNA examiner will look for 2 bits of information that you would get from your mother and your father. If the DNA examiner is able to get DNA data for all 13 locations, then a full DNA profile can be generated. And so in regards to the duct tape that was found on the skeletal remains, they were able to get some information from the sticky side. They were able to get some information on 6 of the 13 locations. And specifically where they were able to get the information from of these locations was a location called D3. And it generated a partial DNA data for a location that included 17 in this D3 location. But she said nobody in the Anthony family had a 17 at the D3 location, that Casey was a 15 in this location, and that Kaylee was a 14 in this location. Heather testifies that the only person that the DNA could have belonged to, and who she believes in her expert opinion who the DNA belongs to on the inside of the sticky tape, was a woman by the name of Lori Gottsman. She was an FBI document examiner, and she says that she is likely the source of the 17 D3 DNA that was found on the sticky side of the tape, and that unfortunately this duct tape got contaminated somehow. Lori did get up and testify, in regards to this, and she did admit that it was her DNA on the sticky side of the tape, that she believes so. She's the only match for it, and that she was careful. She wore gloves. She has no idea how the tape got contaminated, but that it did. Heather also testified that she did this test for decompositional fluids in a dead body, and she did this test on the samples of the stain of where they were claiming that a body was put on. And she also did this sample on all the fabric that was in the car, and that this test for decompositional fluids that secrete from the body after a person has died was found negative. She said that it was also accurate to describe where the remains were found as a dumping ground for trash. Next, the defense called Dr. Timothy Huntington. He was a forensic entomologist, and he has a bachelor's in biology, a master's in entomology, and a PhD in forensic entomology. And he's actually the youngest board certified forensic entomologist by the American board. And I guess his credentials are like insanely impressive. And he's only one of 15 people that's like qualified to testify about this stuff. So he testifies that he's a professor, and he specifically teaches about insect behavior in relation to dead bodies. And his field of work, specifically when he's not teaching and he's like doing his little bug work, his entomology, his field of work is concerned with estimating the time of death by figuring out the time between death and the discovery of the body through the discovery and study of insects that are typically used on the body as a food source. Again, I apologize if I'm saying his title wrong. He explained that the moment, like the second that we die or any animals die, we give off a chemical like into the air. And this specific chemical is a chemical that a blowfly can smell from miles away. And he says that the quickest he's ever seen a blowfly come to a dead body is 13 seconds after that living being, I'm assuming he's testing with animals, has died. And he says that blowflies are typically the first insect to come to a decomposing body because that is what they're attracted to, and that is their food source. They are not garbage kind of seeking animals. They seek dead bodies, human or animal, and that they actually lay their eggs in carcasses. Dr. Huntington then described in detail the liquid ring of decompositional fluid that like releases from the body after somebody dies, and it creates a very specific stain. And he started describing the stain in like insane detail, from the color all the way to the darkened ring. And the reason why this was a big deal, and the district attorney got really upset, they objected, the jury was excused, and the district attorney was trying to argue to keep this information out, but the judge said, no, sit down, be quiet, bring the jury back in, let's keep going. The reason why this was a big deal was because how he was describing this stain that comes from the body, this decompositional fluid, it did not match at all the image of the stain that they found in the trunk of Casey's car. He testifies that you cannot clean out decompositional fluid from carpet, that it is very greasy and it's very sticky, and there's no cleaning service at all that can actually remove these gases and this secretion that comes from the human body, that you would have to throw out the carpet. And therefore, because it can't be removed and it can't be cleaned, insects are going to come to it. Regardless of how many times you clean it, insects are going to come. He testified that in this specific case, the entomological, I have no idea how to say that word, the bug evidence, there we go, that the bug evidence was extremely insignificant in this case, and that he says that with a dead corpse the size of a 3-year-old child, that he would have expected to see hundreds, if not thousands, of insects and flies in the trunk within the hairs of the carpet that you wouldn't be able to get out. He says especially the early colonizing blowflies that come to a human body, and he didn't see these blowflies there. He said that the insects that he did find in the car, which wasn't many, he said that he was actually surprised because these are insects that are generated or gear more towards trash, and that these specific insects that he did find, they actually get their food source from garbage. And some of the garbage that he was citing was pizza, leftover food. He was saying like dirty towels that have like secretion on them, like say you wiped up a drink or you wiped up food that fell on your counter like soup, or spitting tobacco, all these types of things, cigarettes, cigars. And these were things that the defense pointed out to him, showed him pictures of the trash that was inside of the car to the jury. And Dr. Huntington was testifying that yes, these are all food sources that these bugs that I did find would have been attracted to. Next to testify was a man by the name of Dr. William Rodriguez. And the reason why he was a really important witness for the defense is because the district attorney's expert witness, Dr. Voss, he had studied for 5 years at the Body Farm. Well, Dr. William Rodriguez was the founder of the Body Farm. So they were trying to discredit the state's witness with the person that put together this farm and taught him. Dr. Rodriguez started off by saying that the recovery of the bones, of Kaylee's bones, was done very well, and he was quite impressed because it's hard to be able to get all of the bones of a little child. But he said where he thinks was a gross miscarriage of justice was that there was no investigation done and to find out where the remains originally were, because it was very obvious that where the remains were located at was not the original location of their dumping. And he said that this was very important for them to have tried to have found this, and that they could find it through many different ways that they are trained on doing, through looking at the vegetation. If there's missing patches of vegetation within an area, a lot of times that could mean something died there. Or if there's a big discoloration in the grass or the vegetation from the other areas of vegetation around it as well, that can signify that someone or something has died there too. And the reason why he said that this was so important was because the majority of trace evidence is going to be found from where the body was dumped, whether it's teeth, the murderer's DNA, anything the murderer could have dropped on the floor that could have their DNA on it, fibers from clothing, whether it be the murderer's clothing or the victim's clothing, but that most trace DNA is going to be at the dumping site, and that there was no effort done whatsoever by the FBI to figure out where this body originally came from. And then he goes on to testify about the duct tape. He says that he's actually very experienced in duct tape. He also says that where the duct tape was located and found on Kaylee's body, it's actually not evidence of where the duct tape would have originally been. In fact, he says that it's actually the opposite of where the duct tape would have originally been found. He says that it's impossible that the duct tape was located within this area, because if the duct tape was on the body in some manner, it would have been attached to the soft tissue. And that as somebody decomposes and their body begins to erode and the soft tissue begins to go away, and then the muscles begin to go away, and all of the ligaments begin to go away, and the blood begins to go away, that duct tape is not going to stay there, that it's not going to be attached to the skin, and then once the skin's gone, be attached to the muscle, and then once the muscle's gone, be attached to the tendons, and then once the tendons are gone, be attached to the bone. He says that as the body's decomposing, this tape is going to move. He then said that he believed that most likely where this duct tape came from was from the surrounding areas. He says that it was very obvious from the photos that the body was not originally there, and that animals had gotten to the body, that the body was originally in trash bags, and that animals had come and like opened up this bag and pulled the body out, and it's been scattered all over the place through animals eating off of the remains. So he says that it's very possible that there was duct tape on the trash bag that could have been transferred onto Kaylee's face. Or he said the fact that this area, through the evidence and through testimony and what he has seen, this evidence was a very well-known kind of junkyard or garbage disposal, I guess, that people use. And so that it was possible that there was duct tape that was just already lying there that her remains somehow got attached to. Next, the defense called another expert witness by the name of Dr. Spitz. He is a very well-known, I guess, and renowned like forensic pathologist. And he has conducted more than 60,000 autopsies at this time. And he also not only is a doctor, but he's also a scientist. So he has like a PhD and MD, all of the Ds. And he said when he was looking over the work that the autopsy of Caylee Anthony actually wasn't complete, that they did not cut open the skull, and that was extremely important because when you open up a skull after a body has died, there's going to be these black flecks or flakes, like dots, within the inner lining of the skull, and that is actually going to tell you how long the body has been decomposed. And so because they did not complete the autopsy, we actually don't know how long Casey was actually dead for. He also said that these specs will also tell you what position the body was in when they died. So for example, if I was like laying on my side when I died and started decomposing, somehow those like black flakes or specks are going to show you, was I on my back, my side, my front? It'll give you certain information. In regards to the duct tape, Dr. Spitz was very adamant that this was not the murder weapon at all, and that Dr. G should have never concluded that this was a homicide. And the reason why he said this was because duct tape, he said, is like one of like DNA's biggest enemy, because it's almost impossible to get DNA out of the sticky side of duct tape. It's that sticky. That DNA is like a bitch, and it's always going to remain, especially if it's on something that is pro holding evidence such as duct tape. He said that there was not one shred of soft tissue on the duct tape. There was not one shred of skin cells or DNA besides the FBI examiner. He said there was nothing. So he said because there was no traces of soft tissue, DNA on the duct tape, there was absolutely no reason or proof for him to conclude that the duct tape was ever attached to the soft tissue of Caylee's face. That if it was attached to the skin, we would have known, because soft tissue and skin cells would still be within the duct tape. On cross-examination, the district attorney really went hard at this, saying, hey, this is Florida, and she was missing for 31 days. So her body was decomposing for 31 days. It's humid as hell here. It rains on and off sometimes in Florida. Wouldn't the rain and the humidity be a reason why the DNA would have been flushed off of the duct tape? And he said no. He said maybe it would flush off the murderer's DNA on the non-sticky side, the shiny side of the duct tape. But he said on the sticky side of the duct tape that DNA and soft tissue would still be there. That in his experience, with over 60,000 like homicide autopsies and stuff like that, that DNA is almost never removed from the sticky side of duct tape or other products that are similar to duct tape. He says in his opinion, the duct tape was not put onto the body prior to decomposition, that it somehow got there after the remains had already decomposed and they were only dry bones. He said that he also went through the toxicology and anthropology reports as well that were conducted. And he said after going through them that he cannot rule out accidental death and that he cannot rule it a homicide. Now we get to a woman by the name of Crystal Holloway. Crystal Holloway testified that she was the mistress of George Anthony, that she has actually met George Anthony at one of the search parties that he had put on to find Caylee. And that from this search party, that's when their affair had started. She said that he had been over to her house, her apartment, like over a dozen times, and that he was actually at her house like around Thanksgiving. And around that time, they had like this huge heart-to-heart, and George was on the couch and she was like sitting on the floor at his feet. And that George had broken down and he was crying, and they had this really big heart-to-heart. And that is when George told her, he started talking about Caylee and like what had happened. And his exact words, according to her, was that this whole thing was just an accident that snowballed out of control. She testified that he was crying. His eyes were super watery. He was very emotional. So she didn't pry any further and she didn't ask any questions. She was just trying to console him. So after they had this heart-to-heart, Crystal testifies that she actually broke up with George. And the reason why is because they went to this candle lighting ceremony for Kaylee. And I guess this was the fourth one that has been conducted, right? And George had told Crystal that he was going to go home with her after the candle lighting ceremony, but he didn't. In fact, instead he went home with his wife. It's his wife, duh. That he went home with his wife and that he texted her that he wasn't going to be able to make it over to her place. And she said this really upset her because she felt like he didn't respect her enough to give her a phone call, and he texted her instead. And she, in her opinion, that was super disrespectful and just kind of showed that he didn't care for her the way that she cared for him. So she broke up with him. So after they broke up, the defense attorney introduced some text messages between George and Cindy into evidence. And one of the text messages says, from George, "I need you in my life, please." And she says that she received this message from George after she had broken up with him, and that she believed that it was him saying like, "Hey, please don't break up with me. Please don't leave me. I need you in my life." So after Crystal Holloway testifies, George is called to the stand as a rebuttal witness against this by the district attorney. Again, George is sitting in the courtroom through everyone's testimony. So he's already heard what Crystal said. George tells the district attorney that he was actually just friends with Crystal. Like, he didn't have a romantic relationship with her at all. And the reason why he would go over to her house a lot and spend the night was because Crystal told him that she had a brain tumor and that she was gonna die. So he had a lot of compassion for her and he just wanted to like be around her. He then said that the specific text message after the alleged breakup of like, "I need you in my life," wasn't saying that he wanted to get back with her because they were only friends, that it was actually just because he was saying like he needs her in this world and that he doesn't want her to die from cancer. Next, the defense called somebody by the name of Joe Jordan to the stand. And Joe Jordan testified that he was actually a part of something called EquuSearch. And EquuSearch is a company that Cindy Anthony had reached out to, and she had called and been like, please help me like conduct all of these searches for my granddaughter. And so they said yes. So EquuSearch, Cindy and George were all working together to set up a bunch of searches throughout the woods for Kaylee Anthony. And on a specific date in 2008, Joe Jordan testified that he was actually in charge of searching Suburban Drive, which is the location in which Kaylee Anthony's remains were found. And he testified that he didn't find any remains, that his search party didn't find any remains. So he said that when he found out on like December 11th that Kaylee Anthony's remains were found in this specific area, he actually emailed the sergeant's office and said, "Hey, I think something strange is happening here." He emailed them 2 days later on December 13th. And he said, "Hey, just so you know, I think something strange is happening here. Me and my search party looked at this location and we didn't find any remains. We didn't find any remains. So I think somebody had moved the body or moved the remains, or maybe they had taken the remains away. And then after we searched, then they had like dumped the remains there." And they read this email out loud to the jury. On cross-examination, Joe does admit that he actually regrets sending this email to the sergeant. And the reason why he regrets sending this email to the sergeant is because he actually doesn't know exactly where in this area Kaylee's remains were found, and that it is possible that they actually didn't search this like specific area where the remains were found. Next, somebody by the name of Jesse Grund was called to the stand. Now, his testimony wasn't in front of the jury. He was one of the defense's witnesses that they were trying to use to prove sexual assault. But the judge wanted to hear this testimony outside of the presence of the jury first. So Casey used to be engaged to somebody by the name of Jesse Grund, and he testified that she had actually confided in him about her brother. Because again, in the opening statements, Jose Baez alleged that George Anthony, as well as her brother Lee Anthony, had been sexually assaulting her when she was younger. Jesse said that Casey actually confided in her about this, at least just about Lee, not about George. And Jesse testified that there was always this weird, very awkward relationship between her and her brother. And when he had asked her about it, she had confided in him and she had told him, you know, I've like woken up to my brother watching me sleep. My brother has like groped me and like sexually assaulted me in these manners. And the judge ruled that this testimony couldn't come in and couldn't be presented to the jury because it was hearsay and it was irrelevant to the murder. The only reason why I'm bringing it up is because it's important, because this was the only testimony that Jose Baez ever tried to elicit or bring into court really about the sexual assault that Casey alleges happened to her at the hands of her father. So because he really couldn't bring in any evidence of the sexual assault, and his one witness that was going to testify to it wasn't allowed to actually testify in front of a jury, he couldn't bring up the sexual assault in closing arguments. Next, Jose Baez calls Dr. Sally Carrot to the stand, and she testifies about Casey's reaction, right? Because the district attorney was really focused on these 31 days, right? So much so that in the opening statements, you know, the district attorney had a photo for day 1 through 31. And she would say on day 1, Casey Anthony went to Blockbusters with her boyfriend. On day 2, Casey Anthony went and got her nails done. And she had pictures of all of this. And on day 3, Casey Anthony was partying. On day 4, she was doing a hot body contest. And she did this for 31 days, right? And she used the boyfriend to also bring in and show this party lifestyle, carefree behavior. So the reason why Dr. Sally came to testify was because she says that she's an expert in trauma. And she says that actually in trauma, like severe trauma, in young adults that do not have their frontal lobe developed. And if you don't know, in the law, a youthful offender is considered anyone 26 and under. So juvenile is 18 or under 18, so 17 and under. And a youthful offender is going to be anyone from 18 to 26. Because the science proves that your brain isn't fully developed, it can't have the same cognitive functions as somebody with a fully developed frontal lobe. So she's testifying that youthful people in their early 20s, their teens, things like that, they actually can't process this type of trauma as somebody, say, in their mid-30s, 40s, and 50s would process this trauma. That science and research shows that people that are youthful, instead of processing trauma, what they do is they try to disassociate and create this perfect world where everybody's happy and things are happy-go-lucky. The world is perfect, they're happy, and they disassociate, and they also are in denial. And so she's saying that the behavior was actually very typical of a major traumatic event for somebody that was young. On cross-examination, you know, it came out that Dr. Sally was not Casey's doctor. She's not her psychologist. She's not analyzing her. She doesn't know her history, her traumas, anything like this, that she was actually just stating like research evidence. And finally, Lee Anthony, Casey's brother, was called to the stand again by the defense. And he came in as like a last minute witness for the defense again, because Lee had called Jose Baez the night before and basically told him, I have information that I think you need to know about and hear about. So he was able to come and testify to this information, even though the district attorney had no idea what Lee was about to testify to. And the only reason why this was possible as a last minute witness, and instead of, you know, there's a rule of reciprocal discovery where everything I have besides what comes from my client and besides impeachment evidence, which I get to keep due to the People versus Iguzaga, which is a Superior Court case, I had to turn everything else over to the DA. Everything, my witnesses, their contact information, everything, and their opinions, what they said to me, everything, because the district attorney has the right to prepare for that testimony. So the only reason why Lee's testimony is about to come in that the district attorney has no idea about is because Lee is actually the state's witness. They're the ones that put him on their witness list. They're the ones that called him to the stand. Therefore, the law says if this is your witness, you should be fully prepared and vexed. You should know everything they're going to talk about. Opposing counsel has every right to do what they're going to do and question how they're going to question, because you should know. So he comes to the stand, and under direct examination, this time by the defense, Lee testifies that when they were younger and all throughout his childhood, that when one of their pets would die, George would take the body of the pet and he would put it into a trash bag, and then he would take duct tape and he would duct tape close, like the trash bag. You know, at the top where you can like usually put that little wiry thing to hold it shut, he would take duct tape and he would put it around the bag, and then he would go and he would bury the dead animals. And so the defense was doing this because he's trying to point out the similarities that Kaylee's body was found in her Winnie the Pooh blanket inside of a trash bag. And their theory that they're alleging is that this duct tape, originally they thought the duct tape could have been in the landfill, but because of Lee's testimony, they had changed it so that the duct tape could have been on the bag from George, and that it got onto Kaylee's face. So because of the similarities of the bodies being found in bags and attempted to be buried, they're trying to show that like this is George's, I guess, MO of burying things that die. Now the defense is rested and it's time to go into closing arguments. And as always, the district attorney goes first because they have the burden. And the district attorney gets up there, and there were several things that they did in their closing argument that were actually really memorable. One of them was the district attorney gets up there and she says, whose life was better off with Caylee Anthony dead? And then she showed a slideshow of Casey Anthony partying and dancing and of her beautiful life tattoo on her shoulder. And she says, there's your answer. She then also showed an image of Caylee Anthony like smiling and all happy, and then it faded onto the bottom of the face and it faded out to like the remains with duct tape over the mouth, while you can still see Kaylee's like human eyes and forehead, which was also something that really stuck with the jury as well. They continued their argument by saying all the evidence proves that the only person that had anything to gain was Casey. Nobody else was acting like this. Nobody else was partying. She didn't report her daughter missing. She didn't call the police about her daughter. Instead, she partied for 31 days after she knew her daughter was dead. She concocted this huge lie about a kidnapping that happened that she refused to admit to, and that she had lied about the nanny. She had lied about her job. She lied about everything to everybody. And that, you know, Casey had been getting and growing very irritated in the upcoming months to June because she didn't feel like she was able to have this lifestyle with her friends because her parents weren't really helping her watch Caylee anymore. And so she decided to render her daughter unconscious before smothering her with duct tape and then dumping the child's body a block and a half away from the home. The defense got up there for their closing argument and just said, this doesn't make sense. The district attorney's theory, the district attorney's case, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. They can't prove how she died. They can't prove that she died from being smothered or asphyxiated. They can't prove when she died. They have no idea when she died. They can't prove where she died. They don't know if she died in the pool. They don't know if she died in her bed. They don't know if she died in the trunk. They don't know if she died in the fields. They have no idea what, when, where, who, why. He also said that the district attorney's motive doesn't make sense because the district attorney's motive was that Casey wanted to be this childless person. She didn't want to be a mother anymore because being a mother was too hard for her because it made her not be able to have this carefree, youthful life that she wanted. And they said that this was just inaccurate. Her parents gave her a place to stay. She didn't have to pay rent. The parents paid for hers and Kaylee's food. They paid for her gas, her car insurance, her car registration. That Casey had no bills, and that in fact, Cindy and George would actually babysit Kaylee quite often. And this was testified to, that they would babysit like 2-3 nights out of the week when Casey would go hang out with her friends, or when she would go sleep over at Tony's house, because Cindy and George didn't want Casey to be sleeping over at Tony's place. So she would sleep at home and be watched by George and Cindy. So he said that it actually didn't really affect her lifestyle. Again, he wasn't allowed to talk about any alleged sexual abuse because he didn't actually bring in any evidence during the trial of it to the jury. So he can't talk about it in his closing. Jose Baez's, I guess, heavy hitter for his closing argument, if you want to call it that, was that he showed a picture of Caylee Anthony opening up the back door of the patio and going out to where the pool was. And he says, "This is your evidence. This is how Caylee died." And like the words of George Anthony, the alleged words of George Anthony, this was just an accident that snowballed out of control. And he was just relaying his theory through this picture that, you know, Caylee was 3 years old. She was a toddler. She was tall enough at this point to be able to open up that back door, to unlock it and open up that back door and get out to the pool. On July 5th of 2011, the jury had reached a verdict. They deliberated for 11 hours, which could be considered quite short for a murder trial. And the jury came back with a not guilty verdict on first-degree murder. They came back with not guilty verdict on aggravated manslaughter of a child, and not guilty verdict on aggravated child abuse. They just found her guilty on 4 counts of lying to the police. And because she had already served 3 years in jail while she was in trial, waiting for trial, she was pretty much considered credit for time served. She only had 10 more days to serve in county. Due to this verdict of the not guilty verdict, which shocked the whole world, it just sent the whole world into a frenzy. People were livid over this. Something called Caylee's Law was actually put into effect, making it a felony for a parent or a caregiver to not report a child missing within 24 hours. And there were other effects that went into place for Caylee's Law. It varies state to state, but for example, in the state of Florida, if you violate their version of Caylee's Law, it could come with up to a penalty of 20 years in prison. Something else that I want to talk about that really bothers me is that George and Cindy Anthony have made an exorbitant amount of money off of Caylee's death. In fact, they've made over $1.5 million in the past 10 years by writing tell-all books. Their book was called Imperfect Justice, Prosecuting Casey Anthony. They wrote this book and made money off of it. They have made money off of being on TV interviews. They've made money being on a million different documentaries. In fact, they're also going to be on a new documentary on A&E and January 4th of 2024. They have made an exorbitant amount of money off of Caylee Anthony's death. Casey Anthony, she kind of went into hiding after her not guilty verdict. And nobody heard from her until 2022, where she did do a documentary that if you watch it, it is very, you can tell it's very defense, very Casey Anthony oriented. All documentaries are biased, by the way. You can tell it's very biased, but this was the first time she's ever spoken out on Caylee Anthony, on the trial, on the murder. She has remained completely silent, out of the media, out of any sort of attention. And it is said, this documentary is on Peacock, you can watch it if you want. It is said that she actually didn't receive any compensation for this documentary. The only thing that she received compensation for was that they bought the rights to certain photos and videos that she did have of her and her daughter. And Peacock says that it was a very, very minimal amount, I guess, that she was paid for these photo rights. The only reason why I bring that up is because there's a law called the Son of Sam. And the Son of Sam basically says that criminals cannot profit off of their crimes. So if you see all these documentaries about Charles Manson, about Ted Bundy, about whatever, them themselves and their estate can never profit off of it. They can't sell their book rights. They can't sell movie rights. They can't sell documentary rights. You cannot make money off of a crime that you have been convicted of. Now, Casey Anthony was not convicted. George Anthony was not prosecuted or convicted. Everyone is just pointing the finger at each other for who's the murderer, right? except for Cindy Anthony, who does believe that this was an accident that snowballed out of control. Because they're not convicted murderers, they can make money off of this. I just think it's very distasteful that this little 2.5-year-old can't rest. You know, something happened to her, whatever happened to her, there's only 2 people in this world that are gonna know. And she's gone. And I just think it's very grotesque, right? That they're profiting millions of dollars. Anyone's profiting even $1 off of this little girl's death. And with that, the trial of Casey Anthony has come to a close. I hope you all learned something today. And with that, the defense rests.